lovely to see such a lively crowd this time of the evening. Welcome very much to Bokende. We're very glad to see so many people here, and we're very proud to present the book, Creating Coromandel. That's Edna, as you know, is a long-time alumna of the department, doing her PhD here as well. And then Professor Barker, that you also know as an institution at the department by now, I think. So I'd just like to, before we start, give a special word of welcome to some very special people. Silvio Marara, who is the first councillor and the deputy head of mission of the Italian Embassy in Pretoria. To Tiaan Meyer, who's the daughter of Sydney and Victoria Press, who commissioned the Coromandel House, and she's been an invaluable support and a very large driver and impetus behind this project. To Patrick Watson, we're very honoured to have him here as the landscape architect who was involved with the landscape, who were involved with the gardens at Coromandel. And he saw the building actually going up and evolving while he was creating the gardens and inspiring many people in the country, I think, to follow his footsteps in creating natural gardens. Then Marion Moore, who's spent the early years on the farm with her husband Alistair, who was Coromandel's first farm manager. Cathy Munro, who's an esteemed architectural historian and one of the book's peer reviewers, and who served on the committee reviewing the PFA Herbert Prince Colosseum Award, for which the book received a commendation in the research and publication category. So with that, you're not here to listen to me, so I'm going to introduce you to our panel members. And first and foremost is Dr. Edna Peres, who is an independent researcher focusing on heritage and cultural landscapes, regenerative design and resilience thinking. She obtained a PhD from the University of Pretoria, for which she received the Neil Powell Neil Award. While in practice, she nurtured an interest in archival work and research, which led her to begin research on Coromandel, the result of which why we are here tonight. Then we have Professor Arthur Barker, who is an associate professor in this department, and for 13 years he coordinated and taught in the professional master's program, and he currently teaches in the undergraduate program while coordinating design teaching in the legacy, identity and memory research field. His positions architectural design in a continuum of international and local theory, practice and traditions. He's a National Research Foundation C2-rated researcher with a main research interest in post-World War II South African architecture. He's also the chair of the Pretoria Institute of Architecture's Education Committee, a SACAP accreditation panelist and a panel member for the American National Architectural Accrediting Board. And then we have from the Practice Mayat Hart Architects, Brendan Hart, who with his love of buildings and making inevitably led Brendan to architecture, and after 7 years of working on a diverse range of projects, he co-founded Mayat Hart Architects with Jasmine Mayat in 2012. Brendan holds architectural degrees with distinction from the University of the Witwatersrand and a master's degree in the conservation of the built environment from the University of Cape Town. Since 2015, in addition to practice, Brendan is a permanent staff member of staff at the School of Architecture and Planning at the University of the Witwatersrand, where he teaches post and undergraduate architectural history and supervises Masters of Architecture students. His research and writing is also widely published in local and international books and journals. Brendan sits on the committees of a number of professional and volunteer organizations and is an accredited professional member of the Association of Professional Heritage Practitioners. I think before we have the panel move over here, there's a little video that we will be seeing. And then I will hand over to Professor Barker, who apparently is coordinating the panel discussion. Thank you, everybody.
Fellow architects and educators, to piece together the history of the house and its impact on the architectural sphere within the country. I discovered articles and photos published in the late 70s and 80s and also that Zanuso designed a second building for press, a vast corporate headquarters and distribution center for his multinational fashion retail chain. I connected with a fellow architect called Andrea Zamboni from Italy.
To be here with you, telling the story of this masterpiece with this from Italy and then from South Africa, discovering and looking at two different topics, but looking at the same things. And I was making researches for Domus magazine, this wonderful form, architectural form, that appeared in a small picture. The author was Marco Zanuso, one of the most important Italian designer worldwide, not so well known as an architect, no? From the moment I decided to make an article I devoted to this house, during that research I discovered that Edna Peres was doing the same thing from another point of view for another magazine, no, Edna?
Yeah, that's correct. So I had written the article for the Architectural Journal of South Africa, and the perspective that I was looking at was very much on this, trying to discover more about the house and the impact that the house had made in South African architecture. And really it was an introduction for my perspective to Marco Zanuso. And when we then met a few years later online, to discover that there was this wealth of knowledge. Our combined research told the full story of the house.
And the book was coming out, I wouldn't say automatically, but very easily.
Well, welcome everybody. I hope you can hear me. Let me know right at the back. Am I audible enough? Yep. Yes. Great, thank you. I'm going to facilitate the discussion tonight between myself and Edna and Brendan. Welcome to our little lounge here in the front of Bokunda. I hope you're all sitting comfortably. Let me just tell everybody how the session will run. There's 4 sections plus an invitation at the end for questions and, as Edna said, compliments, not comments. But the first section will be about initiation. In other words, how did the book project come about? The second section will be the contextualization. How was the building located in time and space? The third section will revolve around how was the architecture analyzed and then described. And then what is the projection? What is the value add? What will happen after the publication of the book? Now, I remember, or how many of you remember Gus Guernica, the educator that used to teach in this department? A number of you remember him, right? I was fortunate enough, or unfortunate, I'm not sure, to have him as a lecturer at UCT, and he taught me 3 things. The first was, have you ever been to Paris, was the question he asked. And so then I said, no, I'm not quite sure. Do you mean Paris in Bloemfontein or Paris in France? So I learned about France. And then I learned about, he said one day to me, you know, there should be shutters on your windows. That was the other thing. But the most important thing he taught me was about Coromandel. I remember as a third-year student being told to go and look in a magazine called Arbitrare, I think it was in those days, to find out more about the house. So that, for me, that's the one theme that will go through this evening, is the legacy of this house that's happened over time and keeps on repeating itself, either through teaching or the fact that it gets published and so on.
Can you speak up?
Louder. Louder. All right, I shall speak louder. And then the other thing that I think is a theme which runs through the evening is when I started my PhD many years ago, there was a real dearth of publications on South African architects. It was damn difficult to find stuff. It was either very old, like Martinson's book, or Gilbert Herbert's book on Martinson, or they were these self-publications on architects that were often quite hagiographic in their format. And then I said to Edna, it's amazing that this book has made a contribution to that dearth in a way. But the other interesting thing is that I couldn't think of another book that actually was only on one house. But then I asked my colleague Nico Boertes, and he scratched through his shelves and then came across a small volume that was done by Stanley Seitovits. Or someone else had done it on Stanley Seitowitz's Halfway House. And so for me, those are the only two. I can be corrected, and if Roger's online, he's probably chastising me in the background. So with all of that wonderful introduction, hopefully, the question to Edna is, how on earth did this book project start?
So thank you everyone for being here, and thank you Arthur and Krishna. It started with communication from Suzanne. Before that, it started with a passion from Roger Fisher. And I met Suzanne because of a connection that she had with Arthur Barker. And we had a conversation about the house and the conditions of the house. And we were wondering about how we could bring this house into a state in which more people could become aware of it and hopefully revive it and safeguard its future. So through this process, there were 3 ideas that we came up with. We met with an architect called Andrea Zamboni, who is the co-author of the book, and we projected 3 types of projects to communicate this. The first was the book, and it really forms the documentation process of the house, telling the history, because for many of us, we were very curious about the house, and there was a lot of myth and mystery, and not a lot of information. And so pooling together a lot of information to share for others to then delve into and criticize and take what they find interesting from it is the book. The second is to create awareness and share in a way an archive that has been very private with a larger audience, and that is various communications that we've done with the public, including an Instagram page and so on. And the third is the important part of actually conservation of the building, of trying to revive it and allow it to live a longer lifespan and see its maximum potential revived for the community that owns it now. And that was really, I think, where the ball started, was with these 3 ideas, started rolling, but it didn't really gather speed until a few months later when we started consolidating the book. It was also interesting that all of this started as the pandemic was emerging. So it kind of gave us something to focus on when it seemed the world was falling apart. And it was also very interesting how it happened, which was all very much from a distance.
Now, writing and researching is one thing, but getting the thing published.
Your volume needs to be...
Is my volume too low again? I'm trying to have a conversation without shouting. So, Suzanne, the question was, although writing and researching is easy, it's not easy to get something published. So how did that happen?
So that was quite a challenge because, as I said, we were starting to put this together in the pandemic and everybody's freaking out. So publishers were freaking out the most because what's going to happen? Book sales are already not fantastic. What's the future going to hold? And so we started putting our manuscript together, and we sent it out to publishers all over the world, South Africa included. And the response was usually, this is too risky and it's too niche. Who's going to buy it and who's going to be interested in it? And one of the proposals we sent out to was to Artifice Press, who specialize only in architectural publications. And when they replied and said, this sounds fascinating, let's chat, we were ecstatic. And Andrea and I had a very interesting session with Anna Darnby from Artifice Press, and she had concerns about it being very niche and so on, but we spoke through it and it kind of all fit into place and it made sense for them. And so it was quite a strange process from then on, because it all happened over the internet. There was no physical meeting. There was no sitting around a table checking paper quality, none of that. So it was an exciting endeavor and challenge.
Thanks, Edna. And then, in terms of how the book was written, I mean, if you think about books that have been written about buildings and about architecture, they're good ones and they're bad ones, right? There are ones that are limited in their understanding of the work and the architect, and then the others that are much richer. And I'm reminded the other day myself about Peter Blundell-Jones's book on Ansharun, which is a really deep and detailed understanding of not only the man's work, but of the man, which I think is important in how one frames a piece of architecture, because it's a piece of creative work, influenced by time and place and all of that sort of thing. So I was interested in how you and Andrea framed the understanding of the architect and the house.
So that's also quite a beautiful story, because in a way my focus had been very much on the house's influence and its context, so a very South African perspective. Whereas Andrea had discovered the house, I don't know if you heard very well, but he discovered a picture of the house and he was completely mesmerized by the form, and he began researching further into the architect and his time here. So he had a very much a Zanuso perspective and a Zanuso interest. And what happened when we met in early 2020 on Zoom, not in person, and we started speaking, is that we realized that we had two bookends of a story. That really complemented each other and showed the full perspective. So the way that we framed the book was to try to make sense of these two research avenues that we both had that could start to unravel why this building is so intriguing, because that's kind of like also the question that we asked ourselves: why is this building so intriguing? Why does it leave such a legacy? And we thought, well, for people to begin, perhaps they need to understand the context. And so that's what the first part of the book is. And then for those who are interested in the building, they need to understand the process of what went into building the building, what were the ideas, what was the exchange, and all those background stories. And then the third part would be a reflection on all of that, which is the so what is the legacy that it brings, and who are the people that are inspired and continue to build in, I won't say tradition that is directly related to this house, but very much in, I would say in a subconscious way, inspiring this connection, building in connection with nature and building in a natural landscape. And so that's, I think, the way in which we try to tell the story so that it makes sense and that it's useful. Useful for those who know the building and useful for those who have just discovered it.
So it could be read by lay people and by
That was very much the intention, is that you don't have to be an architect to get into the building and into the project and become interested in the story.
And did you fight with your co-author?
No, we didn't. It was magnificent. Maybe because we weren't sitting next to each other. But Andrea said in the video, and I don't know if you could hear him, but it was almost like the book wrote itself. It flowed so naturally. It's such a beautiful story. It's such an inspiring building for us, and we're such passionate people about this project that we would have discussions about topics and become excited about them, but never argue over content or what should be in, what shouldn't. It just made sense to us, and the book really flowed. It was a very natural process.
I remember yesterday when we spoke, you said there's a tendency these days when people write monographs, and I thought, ooh, I better not go down that road, which is that you ask a number of people to contribute to the book, you know, and you said that was definitely something you weren't interested in doing.
Yes, we spoke about that in the beginning because it was a pandemic and we weren't sure that we would be able to get to the archives and all of that. We thought, well, maybe the easiest would be to ask different people to write a chapter and put all of that together. But that wouldn't really flow, and the decision was to keep the narrative going so that it could make sense and you could see the string of ideas flowing one into the other. And especially if we're trying to create awareness about the building, it makes sense that it's a little bit more accessible. Whereas a monograph written with chapters that's too scientific and too academic in its language, not in its research, but in its language, becomes a barrier to many people.
Yeah, you're limiting your audience at the end of the day by doing that. Okay. In terms of the crystallization and how the house was analyzed and described, one of the most important things I think that helps people to understand an architect is their way of working and their process. So was that a specific thing that you wanted to target in the book? And if you did, how did you do it?
Very much. I think it...
I'm afraid you all need to speak up.
Are you the only one who's having a problem with me? Am I mumbling?
Can you hear me if I'm speaking at the back? Okay.
Should I rephrase my question?
No, well, the people that come here sit in the front, maybe. Because for me, it's always too loud. I want to ask.
Thank you. So the question was, Suzanne, that I think it's important when people write about buildings and related architecture that they somehow through that process understand the architect's design process, because that is of value to many people, including students. And so I was wondering whether that was something which was part of the way you wanted to write the book, and if so, how did you do it?
Yes, and I was saying it very much was part of it, because this is such an iconic form, the building, the aesthetic, that we felt, knowing Zanuso's work, and I didn't really know much about Zanuso, but meeting Andrea and hearing Andrea speak about him so passionately, it really unlocked a wealth of information for me about his process and his thinking and his approach to design in general, because Zanuso was not only an architect, he was initially an architect, but he got famous for his design, for his industrial design. And his architecture for many years was almost forgotten. And he had this incredible wealth of building portfolio that demonstrates the same investigation and research method as his design does. And that was very fascinating, because here we have a building that's a very iconic form, but it's the result of a process of thinking. So it's not just designing a building because it looks cool or it's reaching a certain aesthetic, but it's a building that results from a knowledge of the clients, an engagement with the context, an understanding of the family for whom the house was built, and then also everything that was happening in his life, Zanuso's life as an architect, and his way of trying to push the modern era architecture into something that was much more responsive. So not just chasing technology, but trying to create the poetics around it, something that made sense to be lived in. One of the things that he was very fascinated about was typologies and almost designing with cells that accrue to create organisms. And so buildings were in a similar way. They had these typologies and these components, and they start to fit together. And you'll start to see in his buildings a similar approach to his architecture, which is that complexity is hidden, technology is hidden, and the skin of the building is just this incredible experience that is beautiful to look at, but functions and makes sense for the people who are living there. And so this was something that was very important for us to try and explain and demonstrate, especially nowadays where we're becoming so specialized and so niched, that here we have someone who is really a generalist. I mean, he's an industrial designer, he's an architect, and whatever challenge you throw at him, he applies a methodology of problem solving, and that methodology results in various buildings that don't all look the same, and various products that don't all look the same. And that was quite exciting for me, and I think for Andrea as well, to communicate.
Unpack. The thing we discussed the other day was I made a disparaging remark probably when I said that I felt at times the house looked like an alien in the landscape, especially if you look at the early photographs of the house and how it situates itself. It's obviously grown into itself over time. But if you think about the responses to landscape that you can have, all the way from the classic to the romantic, do you think he had a particular attitude to the landscape?
So I think, we tend to like to put people in boxes and say it was a critical regionalist approach or whatever, I think he had the challenge of designing for clients who wanted a house that blends into the landscape. and a house that in many ways he had carte blanche to design. So it was an opportunity to explore various topics that were interesting to him. The house is certainly not on columns, not touching and engaging with the landscape. It's a very bold, conscious choice to move earth, embed itself, be built with a lot of material to last for a long time. And there were very purposeful decisions that he made to engage with the landscape in a way that would enhance experience. So he spent a lot of time walking through the site, cycling, horse riding, and he got a sense of a spirit of the place that he wanted people to experience. So whether it is the spirit of the place, it was their perception of the spirit of the place, and there were certain qualities that he enhanced. He forced perspective with the narrow, tall walls and the atriums. He highlighted landmarks in the landscape, and he allowed the building to diffuse into nature, which was a welcoming for nature to grow back to the building. And so in many ways, I think, I wouldn't be able to tell you that he had a landscape approach or a critical regionalist approach or anything like that, but there was purposeful foundations laid to allow nature and building to merge. And I think those became really successful as the landscape grew, and it was able to create a continuum so that you can't see the line nowadays so clearly between landscape and building.
And what was interesting in our discussion yesterday as well was you mentioned the cut, that the house was actually cut into the landscape quite purposefully. It's almost as if that edge that was cut became another wall. It was a repeat of all the other walls that happened along the side. So that it was, and you told me this morning it was tighter.
There were various iterations. Patrick Watson will be able to tell you in great detail about the positioning of that wall and how it changes your experience of the space. Too far away and it loses that sense of contraction in the landscape and focusing in the building and the threshold between building and landscape. So I think those are all relationships that are part of that experience. That started with that long linear building making its mark, a very strong and purposeful mark in the landscape, exactly. Not at all subtle.
Yes. And then the other devil's advocate question I was asking you was about the transitions in the house, the relationship between the house and the landscape from the inside out. And I was saying that I thought that the linear transitions and the way that it moves east and west were more successful than the ones that moved to the north. And then you said to me, no, Arthur, there's a sunroom, and the sunroom is the transition. The floor material actually changes from the tiles or timber, from the timber to the tree trunks that are situated in the ground. But I'm still not sure about that north-south transition. Did you find anything in your research that explains why it is made the way that it is, that it still feels quite introverted?
So what we found from the research is that there was a very purposeful intention to contrast. So there was a strong play in contrast between the vast, open, almost harsh sometimes on very sunny days and very misty days experience in nature, and then the experience that you would have within the house, which is almost cavernous, it's almost cave-like, it's very dark, it's not that bright sunshine that you have outside. And the experience is almost like it's a building excavated out of the ground, a skeleton, a form that's sculpted out of the ground. And yes, those transitions in east to west are very strong because they are trying to force you to look into the landscape and draw you out, almost like a labyrinth. So as you move into the main living area, you get drawn into the various wings, the girls' wing, the boys' wing, the parents' wing, the service wing, and out into the landscape. Whereas in the threshold of the middle, you have that transition with the steps that go down into the landscape. But it is more of a communal place. So it's not something that you want to force people out into. You actually want them to stay there in the heart of the home, in that heart, that hearth that exists there, literally and metaphorically. And yeah, I think the whole experience of the inside versus out, that the contrast is very much of something that is almost like an organism, an alien organism that embedded itself and was archaeologically extracted. And its form, even when it was built, implied something that was out of time. You couldn't quite tell, is this a Mayan temple? Is it a Baconi ruin? What is this building? And I think the transition is very much of contrast in north to south, and not so much as diffused as it is east to west.
A purposeful reaction.
I think so. I've learned with Zanuso, nothing is not consciously decided.
Great. Now, the book itself provides one with an understanding of the architecture, the architect, even the context of the times is evident. But the book itself is only one part of the entire project. There's a number of other wings, as it were, to this project. Do you want to tell everybody what those are?
So following the book project, or in parallel to the book project, there was also this idea to safeguard the building, the physical fabric of the building. And together with Suzanne, we began to think about how we could, and the community at Coromandel Farm, how we could maximize and utilize the building in a more, let's call it a more revenue and enhanced way, so that by renovating the physical fabric of the building, you can also increase its architectural legacy, but also benefit the people who are around it at this time. And so we reached out to a number of architects in South Africa, and those who practice with heritage architecture, and Brendan and Yasmin and Ant Vervoort and Kathleen Thomashoff, Fritz Thomashoff, and the team were amongst those that we began to speak with. And what was really beautiful is that rather than just engaging with a single person, this collaborative thing started to emerge. And each member of the collaborative brought something special and unique to the project. And that was very exciting, because you have such a strong building with such a strong iconic language to it, and how these nuances from each firm began to piece together a puzzle of responses to this in a very, I would say, sensitive and yet decisive way.
And do you want to reveal anything about what the intention of the eventual project is?
So the intention of the project is to continue what the trust, the Coromandel Trust, have started, which is to use the house as a hospitality destination, which is somewhere that you can visit at the moment, but to upscale it, essentially. So to bring it closer to its original intention when it was designed, to be experienced as a home, and to be enjoyed in nature and in that rural setting. A retreat, an escape, that kind of thing.
And I was thinking, when I saw the exhibition going up, that it's probably been the first time that this house has been exhibited in South Africa. I think you said something about the first time Zanuso's work has ever been exhibited in South Africa.
I stand to be corrected, but as far as I know, it's the first time anywhere in the world there's an exhibition just on this time that Zanuso practiced in Africa and in South Africa. So it's a very unique opportunity, also because he built 2 projects for Sydney Press, the client of the house, one in a domestic scale and one in a massive corporate scale. So it shows the versatility of the architect and also responding in a very rural context and a very urban context. So it's quite exciting to see that dichotomy almost from one architect in a decade.
And the structure of the exhibition itself?
So we have a part of the exhibition reflects on the contents of the book, so you'll be able to delve into the historical aspects, people involved in various themes, and then the other part of the exhibition delves into a projection into its future and the project that the collaborative put together, the revisioning of how the house could be utilized to be maximized into the future.
Brendan, if I could bring you in, and if I was an architect that was asked to work on Coromandel, my first response would be run away. Because whatever you do, you're going to be damned or not, right? It cannot be an easy building to work on. So my question to you is, when you were first invited to become part of the project, what were your first impressions of the house?
So, unlike the rest of the collaborative, I perhaps didn't have this long history, and neither did Yasmin, with the building. I think Ant and the Thomasovs have this history and inspiration and have understood the building. This was our first experience of the building. So perhaps there was an advantage because we didn't know necessarily the reverence for the building that was held by the architectural community. But I think there was a certain level of intimidation, is probably the right word, because you're dealing with an icon and you're tasked with changing, renovating, updating something that everyone admires. And really, how far do you go? How much is enough? How much is too much? And where do you draw that line? So it was challenging. And I think we collectively spoke about the intimidation, and the responsibility is probably the best word that we felt was weighing down on us to do the building justice. I think that's the biggest thing. In many ways, if you look at the proposal that we put together, yes, there's a bigger picture of a client who could potentially inhabit and occupy the building, but in many ways, you could say that the building was our client, that we were responding to what the building wanted and what the building needed, and the building led the way rather than the other way around. And I think it was the collaborative experience perhaps also put us checks and balances. So we've got a range of different opinions, different points of view, and bouncing those off each other led us to, I think, a relatively subtle intervention to really just shift and allow the building to step into a new life. I think that's what's important. We speak about it as a vision, and that's really what we're trying to do is have the building there and show what it could become. There's already so much to work from, but really just allow people to make that mental leap in terms of that shift.
The Borough Charter says do as little as possible and as much as is necessary, right? And if you think about the scales in heritage, on the one hand you can cotton wool that house, right? Or on the other end of the scale, God forbid, sorry Suzanne, you could demolish it, right? And then you could reuse all of those elements. And then that's quite a scale to actually work in. So I'm interested in, where did you guys find yourselves on that scale?
So I think you probably find a lot of our approach came from how we collectively came together. So we were all approached and individually, and then invited to this fabulous long weekend at the house, where we effectively, it was a weekend-long workshop and attempt to try and come to grips with the reality of the house. So you can imagine it's 4 groups of people in this house. Most of us are effective strangers, meeting for the first time. So to a certain extent, we were almost living the experience of what this house could become as a collective home for visitors, this shared living experience. So we got to live in the house, we got to understand the house, we got to understand why it worked, as well as some of the simple pragmatic difficulties of turning a single family home into something that is much more than that. Right. And I think what it ended up becoming was not so much a case of changing what is there, but rather seeing how can we use what is there to become something else. So the proposal really took from the house and did very minimal in terms of intervention. I would say we touched as little as possible, because we valued what was there. Where we did intervene largely in the wing that would have been the staff accommodation is the most dilapidated part of the house, the part that needed the most intervention there. We could motivate it from, firstly, a intrinsic value in the building, which had been quite, that part is quite degraded, as well as the pragmatics. Conservation in the context of South Africa is about giving buildings function, giving buildings purpose, and tying that back to economics. So if a building doesn't have a function and isn't economically viable, we don't have the luxury of the cotton wool option. That is not on the table for any conservation project. So it was really about a lot of time questioning, how is this going to be viable? How can we create the greatest economic value out of this building while not detracting or changing the physical structure? Because people are going to come to visit the Coromandel House for the experience, for that experience and essence that Zanuso tried to embody in the building. So you don't want to change that. You want to celebrate that. So I feel we managed to touch it as little as possible in a way that I think was quite seamless. In many ways, the house told us what it wanted to be.
And where it needed to be repaired, I suppose.
And where it needed to be repaired. I think the part that surprised me the most was, considering the house is probably at very limited maintenance for a decade or more, it is in remarkably good condition. Obviously, the services have deteriorated quite substantially, but I think they were probably quite experimental for the time. So the massive plant, the underfloor ducting, all of those no longer function, but as a living space, it still achieves its goal. If you look beyond the furniture and everything that's there at the moment, you can still understand the intention. So there's those sorts of repairs, but structurally, the building is sound. There's a building of that vast scale with a planted roof and probably 1 or 2 water leaks in the roof. So structurally, it's probably enormously over-engineered. If you think of the concrete structure, and that served it in good stead. And materially, by drawing from the landscape, the building just ages and weathers and I think looks better with time. So our approach was not to strip back the trees and remove the ficus and the roots. That is part of the beauty of it. We wanted the building to look like it had this 40-year passage of time, but just allow it to function and to regenerate, particularly the internal spaces, which probably have suffered the most over time. And it's just, I think it's more through a lack of understanding of the intention than anything else. I think the building is, as I said, remarkably well looked after, considering its relative lack of maintenance.
It's almost as if it has a good patina.
Absolutely.
That you don't want to rub off at all. You just need to increase that patina over time.
I also think there's sometimes value in somebody not having enormous amounts of money and funds to pump into a project. So to a certain extent, the kitchen hasn't been changed, the rooms haven't been gutted, the bathrooms are still their original quirky 1970s oval shapes and so on. And if there had been 20 years ago seed funding for something, we probably would have been in a very different situation. So a benign neglect can sometimes serve the purposes of conservation, and I think that's not to be underestimated. So
can I use that?
With
I
pleasure.
think we
Quote,
should.
yes.
We'll quote.
So yeah, I think the building is lucky to not have had somebody want to modernize it. And it's had the opportunity to be able to grow old and become valued before it became tiled and whatever it might have happened.
What a beautiful way to end our discussion. Thank you very much. I'd like to open up the discussion to anybody in the audience who'd like to ask a question. There's a question over there. If you wouldn't mind just stating who you are, where you're from, and what your question is.
I'm interested in how it fits into the broader continuum of architectural history. So I have a question, because great architects and great works of architecture teach us something that's very fundamental about the nature of architecture and the nature of space and what architecture is. So if you could pick one thing from your inquiry into the architect and the building, what would you say would be a key takeaway for someone who's looking forward to reading the book? Someone could take away and learn about what architecture is.
Okay, that's a great question, and I don't know if the answer will disappoint you. But it's to remind us that we're part of nature and to bring us closer to that relationship.
Thanks, Edna. A question at the back?
Hi, I'm Nadia Lloyd-Lister, lecturer at TUT. I just want to find out, the upgrades, are they going to affect financial accessibility to our students?
Oh, the current plans.
Tourism versus learning?
Well,
The visits.
yeah, I think part of our ambition and our goal is that the house could be used as a learning place still, so that it could be both enjoyed. So let's put it in this way. The house would have two streams. It would have the one that is the luxury aspect that brings money to the project and keeps it going. And then there is the learning aspect, which is a transfer of knowledge, the exchange of ideas, the cross-pollination between countries, because there is a relationship, an Italian-South African relationship, and hopefully broader, internationally, more people could come and visit, more students. But definitely an idea of a master class kind of space, but even smaller than that, an exchange like Arthur regularly does with his students, taking them to the house to experience the place. And that is something we would not want to lose.
Thanks. Graham.
I'm Graham Young, ex-cookie. I'm just interested in the stables as well. And at this stage is because when I was last there, I just wanted to cry, seeing what was happening to those beautiful buildings. And is there some way thought about arresting? Here we don't have benign decay, we have aggressive decay. What's happening there, if anything?
So part of the intention is to include a project for the stables that can also see them renovated, but not to function as stables. They would have to be a completely new use, which also proves to be more a challenge. The stables their construction is much more fragile, the decay is much more rapid, and the amount of intervention would have to be much larger. And to find a use for that makes sense within the context would have to be a second step. We have tried to investigate some avenues to try and arrest the decay, but unfortunately I can't tell you we've gotten very far. So if anybody can, please speak to Suzanne afterwards.
Crowdfunding. There's another question at the back and then in the front. Yes, thank you.
Mr. Simon, 86 Red Bricks Architect. Concerning the economic part, because obviously you're talking about the restoration of the project, it has to sort of fulfill some kind of economic, make a business out of it effectively. Do you have a lot of information to tap from, especially from an academic point of view, or are you pretty much writing the book on this?
There's a lot of archival material. So from the historical part that we can reference. And there are precedents that we can reference, but I don't know if you would like to take it further, Brendan.
I think a lot of the understanding the economics of it is also understanding who the potential end user is going to be. So the proposal that the vision that we've put together is to entice an investor, to entice an end user. So it's quite a difficult one to understand because we're not yet sure what the financial input would be. So it's really trying to make it open-ended enough that somebody can project their vision in while still being respectful for what the building could be. So it's really a bit of a balance. And I think that's probably the single biggest challenge is getting the economics to work. But to a certain extent, again, the house has told us how far we can push it. It's now trying to find the model in terms of lodge or accommodation that will fit within that. So it is somebody who's looking for an X-bedroom luxury lodge. We know what it can offer. It's now trying to find the service provider to fit that.
We're in the matchmaking phase.
Thank you. The gentleman in the blue shirt.
Yes, Brian Meyer, also ex-Dickie. Do you have a rough estimate of an initial cost to just bring this back to something which is stable and won't deteriorate any further? And I'll tell you why, cost. Do you have some sort of idea? Is it millions, tens of millions? Because I hear what you're saying, and I'm not saying it's not going to work, but Frank Lloyd Wright's got many of these houses throughout the United States, and I know Taliesin recently, with COVID, they basically closed down. They did exactly the same terms used, is decay, it's, rehabilitation, it's this, it's that, all the same words. They had to throw in $11 million to get that thing sorted, and they only have 25,000 visitors a year. Now, this is Frank Lloyd Wright and Taliesin. So, although I hear that you think you can actually create something which generates an income, personally, I think that's flawed. I think you need a benefactor. I think you need someone who's willing to throw money at this, and then get it to a point where it's actually stabilized. Because I don't see from an economic point, and as a 5-star guest house owner myself, I can tell you now the type of feed you need to keep this going. So I'm just putting that out there. Did you do an initial assessment of what you think it would cost to get this particular building to a point where it won't deteriorate any further?
Yes. There are assessments done, cost assessments, there are budgets, there are projections, and that has been done.
Is it millions?
It's millions.
Tens of millions or millions?
It's millions. Would you like to be the benefactor? If you would like to be the benefactor, we can have a meeting afterwards, and I'll give you the breakdown.
You need to put it out there, because there's no way that you can justify any business by putting in tens of millions. I think you're going to recoup that by having people come stay there. So I think you need to put it out there. People, we need tens of millions.
Absolutely.
And there are fortunately a lot of people with a lot of money who may just want to do that.
Yes, yes.
Thanks for the question. We'll take one more because I'm sure we all want a drink at this point. Hello, it's you.
I think we're all experiencing a sense of sadness. So I'll speak on behalf of the architectural community because, I had a birthday there. There's memories that we all have experienced in the space that it's actually quite nostalgic and it makes me feel like crying. To think that we won't be able to easily access that building again by phoning Sharon and saying, can you book it up for me? So I think there's a sadness and maybe the question that we had about what would it cost to actually preserve it and have the Coromandel farm still run it without making it a profitable thing is actually something to consider because within our community, it actually, as an architect, it feels you hold this gem that you kind of can share with the people that know about it. So I think it's just this, I think everyone can kind of relate to that.
Thanks for the kind comment.
I think it's just a sadness as well.
I think if I can speak to that, Johnny, if we could crowdfund and all of us collectively, you know, like raise the enormous budget that is necessary, and it's enormous. It's the price of a very big new house. If we could do that, then let's do it. You know, let's crowdfund. Let's say I pledge X amount. Let's raise a campaign, because I think there's an opportunity to really make a big stand about something that means, a building that means something to a lot of people, and then have a very close relationship with the community owner, and you know, create a relationship, a bond between them. So if that's an avenue that this audience feels is possible, then I stand behind it. What we really want to do is to not let it, as romantic as it is let it get it to a point where it can't be appreciated anymore. That I don't think any of us want.
Great. Thank you, everybody, for your questions. Thanks very much, Brendan, for being part of the panel and for teaching me something this evening about benign neglect. Okay. I shall now ponder that this evening. And then, Edna, I have to thank you for a number of things. First of all, for being a very caring person that takes work seriously, and that you have really thought carefully about this project and how it can have legs in the future. So the book is not just something which stands on its own. I have to thank you also for decreasing the dearth of publications on buildings in South Africa, which I think is important, and one specific house. And the way that you did it with your level of expertise and your care is something that I think hopefully everybody will appreciate when they read the book. So thank you for that. And I hope there will be more.